Hello there, and welcome. Tonight, we are drifting gently into a world carved from stone, silence, and time itself. Not a myth, not a legend, but one of the most enduring achievements of the ancient human mind. This is a journey into ancient Egyptian temples, not as tourist monuments or ruins frozen in history, but as living systems of belief, psychology, astronomy, ritual, and embodied meaning. These temples were not built simply to impress the eye. They were built to shape the mind, calm the body, and align the human soul with the rhythms of the universe. For thousands of years, people stepped barefoot onto cool stone floors, crossed thresholds marked by shadow and light, and felt themselves entering a space where ordinary time dissolved. These structures were designed to slow you down, to quiet your thoughts, to guide your attention inward while pointing your awareness outward toward gods, stars, cycles, and eternity. What looks like architecture was also instruction. What appears decorative was functional. And what feels silent today was once alive with breath, incense, chanting, and movement. If you enjoy these gentle journeys into the deeper layers of history and mind, you are welcome to like, subscribe, or leave a quiet comment. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. But for now, there is nothing you need to do. Let your shoulders soften. Let your breathing slow. Allow the weight of the day to settle away from you. And as your eyes grow heavy, let us begin. Ancient Egyptian temples were not places for crowds. They were not communal gathering halls like later religious buildings. Most people never entered the deepest spaces at all. Instead, temples were cosmic machines, carefully calibrated environments where the human world met the divine. Every wall, corridor, column, and ceiling carried meaning. The farther inward you moved, the darker, quieter, and more restricted the space became. This physical narrowing mirrored a mental one. Distraction faded. Attention sharpened. The world outside receded. From the moment the person approached a temple, the experience had already begun. Long processional roads stretched outward, often lined with statues or sphinx. These avenues created anticipation. They lengthened the transition from ordinary space into sacred space. Walking them slowed the body and focused the mind. This was not accidental. Distance itself was part of the ritual. At the temple entrance, massive pylons rose like artificial horizons. Their sloping sides framed the sky, creating a visual gateway between earth and the heavens. Passing through them was symbolic of crossing from the chaotic outer world into an ordered cosmic interior. Above the doorway, carved reliefs showed gods granting authority, balance, and protection. The message was clear before a single step was taken inside. You were entering a different order of reality. Inside the courtyard, light still reached the ground. The space was open, expansive, and alive with air. This was the most accessible area of the temple, where limited public rituals could occur. But beyond this point, columns multiplied and ceilings lowered. Light fractured into beams and shadows. Sound softened. Movement slowed naturally as the environment guided the body without instruction. The famous columns of Egyptian temples were not just supports, they were stone forests. Many were carved to resemble bundled reeds, lotus flowers, or papyrus plants. These were not decorative choices. They symbolized the primeval marsh from which creation itself emerged in Egyptian cosmology. To walk among these columns was to walk through the mythic beginning of the world, reenacting creation with each step. As you moved deeper, the floor often rose slightly, while the ceiling dropped lower. This subtle compression changed posture and breathing. People instinctively lowered their voices. The architecture shaped behavior without command. This is one of the most overlooked aspects of ancient temple design. The builders understood embodied psychology long before the term existed. They knew that space influences state. At the heart of the temple lay the sanctuary, small, dark, enclosed. This was the dwelling place of the god, not for public viewing, but for ritual interaction between priests and the divine presence. The god's statue was not considered symbolic. It was believed to house the god itself during ritual moments. The temple was, in this sense, a living organism with a beating spiritual center. Rituals performed inside were precise and repetitive. The same actions at the same times, day after day, year after year. This repetition was not monotony. It was stabilization. The Egyptians believed the universe required constant maintenance to prevent chaos from returning. The temple was a tool for holding reality together. Incense smoke curled upward, carrying scent into the dark. Chanting followed rhythms aligned with breath and movement. These were sensory technologies. Smell, sound, and motion worked together to shift awareness. Modern neuroscience would recognize these effects as regulation of the nervous system. The ancient Egyptians experienced them as communion with the gods. Temples were also astronomical instruments. Many were aligned with solstices, equinoxes, or specific star risings. On certain days of the year, sunlight pierced the darkness and illuminated the inner sanctuary for only a few moments. These events were not symbolic accidents. They were engineered experiences of cosmic alignment. Light became a message from the heavens, confirming order, time, and divine favor. As you move even deeper into the logic of ancient Egyptian temples, something subtle begins to emerge. These were not merely places where rituals happened. They were places designed to change the state of consciousness of anyone who entered them. Long before modern science spoke of altered states, sensory deprivation, or attention regulation, these temples were quietly doing all of it through stone, rhythm, and time. One of the most striking features is how silence was engineered. Thick walls blocked outside noise. Narrow corridors absorbed sound. High ceilings in columned halls softened echoes. Even footsteps changed tone as stone replaced sand beneath the feet. The deeper one walked, the quieter the world became. Silence was not emptiness, it was a medium. In silence, attention turns inward. The mind slows. Thoughts stretch out and lose urgency. The temple invited this shift without instruction. Light followed the same logic. Outside, the sun was overwhelming, bright, unforgiving. Inside the temple, Light became rare, precious, controlled. Small openings allowed thin beams to travel across walls at specific times. Darkness was not fear. It was containment. In dimness, the senses sharpen. Breathing deepens. Awareness becomes more present. The temple taught the body how to listen. The priests who worked within these spaces lived by precise schedules. Their days were organized around ritual timing, purification, and repetition. Before approaching the inner sanctuaries, they bathed, shaved, and changed clothing. These acts were not symbolic gestures alone. They were psychological transitions. Each step stripped away the ordinary self and prepared the body for a different mode of being. Clothing itself mattered. Linen was preferred, light and breathable, minimizing discomfort and distraction. Jewelry was ritualized. Scents were chosen carefully. Every sensory detail served a purpose. When repeated daily, these rituals trained the nervous system to enter a calm, focused state almost automatically. The body learned the temple. The gods worshipped within these spaces were not imagined as distant moral judges. They were forces of balance. Mat, the principle of cosmic order, truth, and harmony, was not an abstract concept. It was something that had to be enacted constantly. The temple was where Mat was maintained against the ever-present threat of chaos. This worldview shaped how space was understood. Straight lines, symmetry, and repetition were not aesthetic preferences. They were expressions of order. Columns stood evenly spaced. Reliefs followed strict registers. Proportions repeated across temples, regardless of scale. The repetition itself was stabilizing. It reminded the mind that the universe followed patterns, even when life felt uncertain. Time inside the temple behaved differently. Rituals connected the present moment to the moment of creation itself. When a priest recited a hymn, he was not remembering a myth. He was reenacting it. In Egyptian thought, repetition did not weaken meaning. It preserved it. Each ritual refreshed the world, like a heartbeat renewing life. This is why temples were aligned not only to the sun, but to the Nile. The river's flooding cycle governed agriculture, survival, and social rhythm. Temples encoded this cycle into festivals and ceremonies. When the waters rose, rituals acknowledged renewal. When they receded, rituals honored stability. The temple linked human time to environmental time. Even the materials chosen for temples carried meaning. Stone was preferred over mud brick because stone endured. It resisted decay. It mirrored the eternal nature of the gods. Mud brick was for homes, temporary and human. Stone was for what must last beyond generations. This distinction shaped how Egyptians viewed permanence and impermanence. Inscriptions often included lists of offerings: bread, beer, meat, incense, cloth. These were not bribes to the gods. They were exchanges that sustained balance. The gods received nourishments so they could continue sustaining the world. This reciprocal logic created a sense of participation rather than submission. Temples were also centers of knowledge. Priests studied medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and writing within their walls. Knowledge was not separated from spirituality. Understanding the body, the stars, and the land was part of serving the gods. Healing rituals often combined practical treatments with chants and symbols. The boundary between science and belief was fluid. Even illness was interpreted through balance. Disease could arise from physical causes, but also from spiritual imbalance. Treatment addressed both. This holistic approach did not reject the body. It honored it as part of a larger system. The temple, again, was the place where systems were realigned. As foreign powers eventually entered Egypt, temples absorbed new influences without losing their core structure. Greek rulers adopted Egyptian temple architecture. Roman emperors presented themselves in traditional reliefs, offering to ancient gods. The form endured even as politics changed. Stone remembered what power forgot. Standing in these temples today, stripped of priests, incense, and ritual sound, one might think something essential is missing. Yet the architecture still speaks. The proportions still guide the body. The silence still settles the mind. The light still arrives with intention. Something of the original function remains intact. You may notice, even now, how your breathing has slowed as you imagine these spaces, how your thoughts arrive less urgently, how time feels slightly stretched. This is not imagination alone. It is the echo of a design meant to shape inner experience. Symbols inside ancient Egyptian temples were not metaphors meant to be interpreted casually. They were active components in a system of meaning that worked on the mind through repetition and familiarity. A falcon was not just a bird. A scarab was not just an insect. An ankh was not just a shape. Each symbol carried layers of association that were reinforced daily through ritual, story, and environment. When the eye encountered these forms again and again, the mind did not need to analyze them. Recognition itself was enough to trigger meaning. Hieroglyphs were not written to be read silently. They were designed to be seen, spoken, and embodied. Many inscriptions faced inward toward ritual spaces rather than outward toward the public. This tells us something important. Writing in temples was not primarily for communication between people. It was communication between humans and the divine, and between moments in time. Words carved in stone did not expire. They remained present, always active, always available. The act of carving itself was considered sacred. To inscribe a name, a hymn, or a ritual formula was to anchor it into reality. This is why erasing a name was considered a severe act. It was not vandalism, it was metaphysical violence. Removing a name disrupted continuity. The temple preserved identity across time by keeping names alive. Gods within temples were not worshipped equally everywhere. Each temple had a primary deity, often linked to the region, the landscape, or the local economy. A temple near fertile land might emphasize gods of growth and abundance. A temple near the desert might emphasize protection and transition. This localization made religion intimate. The divine was not abstract. It was responsive to place. Yet beneath these differences was a shared structure. Almost all temples followed the same inward progression, from openness to enclosure, from light to dark, from many to one. This mirrored a psychological movement from external awareness to internal focus. The architecture trained attention gradually rather than abruptly. Nothing was sudden. Nothing startled the nervous system. Even the sacred was introduced slowly. Movement within the temple followed prescribed paths. Processions traced routes that were repeated over generations. Feet wore grooves into stone floors. These physical traces reinforced memory. The temple remembered movement. It remembered where people walked, paused, turned, and stopped. Over time, the body learned these routes without conscious thought. Festivals temporarily reversed the temple's usual restrictions. During certain days, statues of gods were carried out into the open, allowing the wider population to encounter the divine presence. These moments were rare, powerful, and emotionally charged. They broke routine just enough to renew collective meaning. Afterward, the god returned to the inner sanctuary, and order resumed. This rhythm of concealment and revelation mattered. Constant exposure dulls attention. Rare access sharpens it. The Egyptians understood this intuitively. By limiting access to the sacred, they preserved its impact. Scarcity of experience increased depth of feeling. Temples also encoded moral order, but not through commandments carved in stone. Instead, morality was embedded through imagery and repetition. Scenes showed gods rewarding balance and punishing excess. Kings were shown offering order to the gods, reinforcing the idea that leadership itself was a ritual responsibility. Power was legitimate only when aligned with cosmic balance. The king's presence in temple reliefs was not propaganda in the modern sense. It was cosmological necessity. The king functioned as a mediator between worlds. By appearing in ritual scenes, the king was symbolically present at all times, maintaining order even when physically absent. The image did the work continuously. This idea of images acting in the world shaped Egyptian art. Figures were shown in idealized forms, not because artists lacked realism, but because permanence mattered more than momentary accuracy. The ideal form endured, the temporary did not. The temple preserved the eternal version of reality, not the fleeting one. Even damage and repair carried meaning. When a wall cracked, it was repaired ritually. When a statue broke, it was carefully restored or replaced. Broken sacred objects were not discarded casually. They were buried respectfully, acknowledging their previous role. Nothing that had once held meaning was treated as meaningless. Sound inside the temple was controlled deliberately. Instruments were used sparingly. Voices followed measured patterns. Silence between sounds mattered as much as sound itself. This pacing prevented sensory overload. It kept attention anchored. Modern listeners might describe it as meditative. The Egyptians experienced it as proper order. Smell, too, played a central role. Incense blends were complex, layered, and consistent. Certain scents were reserved for specific rituals. Over time, smell alone could signal the beginning of sacred time. The nervous system learned to associate these scents with calm focus and reverence. Memory and emotion fused through repeated exposure. The temple was therefore not a place you visited occasionally. It was a training ground for perception. Those who worked there learned to regulate attention, emotion, and behavior through structured repetition. The environment shaped the inner life of its inhabitants slowly and reliably. As dynasties rose and fell, temples outlasted them. Political power was transient. Sacred space was stable. Even conquerors often chose to maintain temples rather than destroy them, sensing their role in social and psychological order. To dismantle a temple was to invite instability. Eventually, rituals faded. Priests left. Gods were renamed or forgotten, but the stones remained. And stones remember proportion. They remember alignment. They remember the quiet logic of spaces built to guide the human mind toward stillness and meaning. What becomes increasingly clear is that ancient Egyptian temples were not passive containers of belief. They were active environments designed to guide attention moment by moment. Nothing inside them competed for urgency. There were no sharp contrasts meant to shock, no sudden revelations meant to overwhelm. Everything unfolded gradually, inviting the mind to slow enough to notice subtlety. This pacing mattered. A rushed mind cannot perceive meaning layered over time. One of the most overlooked elements of temple design is repetition without redundancy. Motifs repeat, yet never feel mechanical. Columns echo one another, but small variations prevent monotony. Reliefs follow familiar structures, but details shift with context. This balance between sameness and variation keeps attention engaged without strain. The brain recognizes pattern, then gently stays awake for difference. It is a state modern psychology might describe as relaxed alertness. Color once played a larger role than stone alone suggests today. Temples were painted in vivid hues, though most have faded with time. Blues echoed the sky and water. Greens symbolized growth and renewal. Reds carried associations with energy, danger, and protection. Gold reflected sunlight, divine presence, and incorruptibility. These colors were not decorative flourishes. They were emotional cues, shaping how space felt before a single thought formed. Ceilings were often painted with stars, turning interior spaces into symbolic skies. This inversion was deliberate. The heavens were brought inside, enclosing the worshiper within a cosmic order. Standing beneath the stone sky, the boundary between above and below dissolved. The human body became positioned inside the universe rather than beneath it. Orientation shifted quietly, yet profoundly. The Egyptians understood that scale alters perception. Colossal statues dwarfed the individual, not to humiliate, but to recalibrate perspective. When the self feels small, personal concerns loosen their grip. Modern research would describe this as an awe response, linked to reduced self-focus and increased openness. The temple induced awe not through spectacle alone, but through proportion and patience. At the same time, not all spaces were vast. Some chambers were intentionally intimate. Narrow rooms with low ceilings created containment rather than grandeur. This alternation between expansion and enclosure prevented emotional monotony. The body moved between feeling small and feeling held. This rhythm stabilized experience. Temples also operated on predictable daily cycles. The god's statue was awakened, washed, clothed, and fed at the same times each day. Lamps were lit and extinguished according to ritual schedules. Doors opened and closed in rhythm with the sun. Predictability mattered because it anchored meaning. In a world shaped by seasonal floods and environmental uncertainty, regular ritual created reliability. This regularity trained expectation. The nervous system learns from repetition. When events follow known patterns, vigilance decreases. Energy is conserved. Calm becomes easier to access. The temple was not merely a place of worship. It was a place of nervous system regulation, embedded within religious practice. Dreams held special significance in temple culture. Some temples functioned as incubation centers, where individuals slept inside sacred spaces seeking divine insight. These were not casual dreams. They were prepared for through fasting, purification, and ritual focus. The environment itself shaped the dream state. Darkness, silence, and expectation worked together to influence the mind during sleep. This practice reveals a sophisticated understanding of context-dependent cognition. The Egyptians knew that where you sleep matters. What you expect matters. The body carries waking experience into dreams. By shaping the environment before sleep, the temple shaped the content of the dream. Healing rituals followed similar logic. Illness was treated not only through remedies, but through restoring order. A sick person entered a structured space, followed predictable rituals, and encountered symbols of balance. Even when cures failed, the experience itself reduced chaos. That reduction mattered. Priests were trained not only in ritual, but in restraint. Emotional control was expected. Movements were deliberate. Speech was measured. This discipline created a calm presence that reinforced the temple's function. Humans mirror each other's states. A regulated guide helps regulate others without instruction. The temple system understood this implicitly. Children raised near temples absorbed this environment long before they understood theology. They learned how to move, when to be quiet, how to wait. The temple shaped social behavior across generations. It taught patience in a world without clocks. It taught presence without naming it. Even conflict was addressed symbolically within temple culture. Chaos was personified, named, and ritually defeated in controlled contexts. This externalization allowed fear to be contained rather than denied. By giving chaos a form, it could be managed. Modern psychology would recognize this as a way of reducing diffuse anxiety by giving it structure. Over time, as belief systems shifted and temples lost their central role, many of these functions disappeared from daily life, but the human nervous system did not change. It still responds to rhythm, proportion, repetition, silence, and meaning. This is why ancient temples continue to feel powerful even when their original rituals are forgotten. You may notice how imagining these spaces creates a sense of slowing even now. The mind naturally matches the pace of the environment it enters, even in memory. Attention follows architecture. Breath follows rhythm. Thought follows space. As temples continued to shape the inner and outer lives of those who moved through them, they also shaped identity itself. To belong to a place was to belong to its gods, its rhythms, its stories etched into stone. Identity was not only personal, it was spatial. The land, the river, the temple, and the body formed a single continuous system. To step into a temple was to step into a larger version of oneself, one that extended beyond a single lifetime. Names carried enormous weight in this system. A name was not merely a label, it was a declaration of existence. To speak a name was to activate it. To carve a name was to preserve it across time. Temples were filled with names because they were filled with lives meant to continue. Kings, priests, donors, and gods shared the same walls, bound together by inscription. Memory was not fragile here. It was engineered. This focus on memory shaped how death was understood. Temples were not tombs, yet they were deeply connected to ideas of continuity beyond physical life. The rituals performed inside them reinforced the idea that existence did not end. It transformed. Cycles continued. Just as the sun died each night and returned each morning, so too did life move through phases rather than conclusions. The temple thus trained a particular relationship with time. Time was not a straight line racing forward. It was a series of returns. Festivals repeated yearly, rituals repeated daily, myths repeated eternally. This repetition softened fear of change. When loss occurred, it was held within a larger pattern that promised renewal. Even catastrophes were absorbed into this framework. Droughts, invasions, political collapse, these were interpreted as disruptions of balance, not meaningless disasters. The response was not despair, but correction. More ritual, more alignment, more attention to order. The temple offered a way to respond to uncertainty without panic. Writing inside temples reflected this worldview. Texts were rarely speculative or argumentative. They were declarative. They stated what is, what has always been, what must continue. There was little interest in novelty for its own sake. Stability was the highest value. Change occurred slowly, layered atop what already existed. This does not mean Egyptian culture was stagnant. It evolved continuously, but evolution happened through accumulation rather than replacement. New gods merged with old ones. New meanings layered onto familiar symbols. Temples expanded outward, wrapping innovation around tradition like new stone around an old core. This layering had psychological effects. It created a sense of depth rather than rupture. The past was never gone. It was physically present beneath the present. Walking through a temple meant walking alongside ancestors without needing to imagine them. They were already there, in stone, in name, in orientation. The body responded to this continuity. Humans are pattern-seeking creatures. When patterns persist across generations, they create safety. The temple was a place where nothing felt accidental. Every direction, every measurement, every symbol implied intention. Intention reassures the mind. It reduces existential uncertainty. Temples also structured social hierarchy without constant enforcement. Access to inner spaces was limited, not as punishment, but as rule definition. Each person knew where they belonged in the ritual landscape. This clarity reduced friction. Ambiguity was minimized through architecture rather than law. Yet even within hierarchy, there was movement. Apprentices advanced. Priests aged into authority. Roles were learned through observation and repetition rather than instruction alone. The temple taught by immersion. It shaped behavior quietly over time. Seasonal festivals temporarily dissolved boundaries. During these moments, the sacred flowed outward and the people flowed inward. Music, procession, color, and celebration reconnected the population to the temple's core meaning. These events were emotionally rich and physically memorable, reinforcing belonging. Memory formed not only through thought, but through the body. Smells, rhythms, walking routes, chants. These experiences lodged themselves beneath language. Long after details faded, the feeling remained. This is why temple culture endured, even as literacy remained limited. The knowledge was embodied. When later cultures encountered Egyptian temples, they often misunderstood their purpose. To outsiders, they appeared rigid, repetitive, even excessive. But repetition was the mechanism. Excess was the point. The system worked because it surrounded the individual completely. There was no separation between belief and environment. Even today, when modern visitors step into these spaces, stripped of their rituals and color, something still registers. People lower their voices. They slow their pace. They feel watched, not by gods, but by time. This reaction is not taught. It is elicited. Stone corridors still narrow attention. Vast halls still evoke awe. Enclosed sanctuaries still invite quiet. The nervous system responds as it always has. The temple's design continues to function, even without explanation. As night fell in ancient Egypt, the temple did not become inactive. Lamps flickered. Guards walked predictable routes. The presence of order continued through darkness. The god was never abandoned. Continuity was maintained, even when visibility vanished. This mattered deeply in a world where darkness was real, heavy, and uncertain. The temple stood as a constant. Something remained awake when others slept. That idea alone could calm the mind. Emotion inside ancient Egyptian temples was not something to be expressed openly or dramatically. It was something to be contained, guided, and transformed. The temple did not encourage emotional release. It encouraged emotional alignment. Feelings were expected to settle into rhythm, just as bodies settled into pace and breath settled into pattern. In this way, emotion became part of order rather than a force to be suppressed or indulged. Fear, for example, was not denied. It was given structure. Chaos was personified as known figures, named, depicted, and ritually overcome. By giving fear a form, the culture prevented it from becoming formless anxiety. The unknown became narratable, and what can be narrated can be managed. Grief followed a similar path. Loss was acknowledged, but it was never final. Temple imagery constantly reinforced continuity beyond interruption. Death scenes were paired with rebirth scenes. Morning rituals were embedded within broader cycles of renewal. This framing did not remove pain, but it prevented despair from becoming absolute. Sorrow existed inside a larger container of meaning. Joy, too, was regulated. Festivals were joyous, but joy was not constant. It arrived on schedule, then receded. This created anticipation. Anticipation sharpens experience. When joy is rare, it is felt more deeply. The temple calendar preserved emotional contrast rather than flattening it. Authority within the temple was subtle. Power did not rely on force or spectacle. It relied on inevitability. Everything felt as though it had always been this way and always would be. This sense of inevitability is psychologically stabilizing. When structures feel older than any individual, resistance feels unnecessary. The system carries itself. This is one reason rebellion was rare within temple contexts. The environment itself dissolved urgency. You could not move quickly. You could not shout. You could not act impulsively. The space did not allow it. The architecture regulated behavior before willpower was required. Memory inside the temple did not function like personal memory. It functioned like collective memory made physical. You did not need to remember rituals consciously. They were embedded in walls, floors, orientations, and schedules. Memory lived outside the mind, reducing cognitive burden. The individual was supported by the environment. This externalization of memory freed mental space. When you do not need to remember everything, attention becomes available for presence. This is one reason ritual repetition can feel calming rather than boring. The mind rests inside known sequences. The temple also shaped the experience of selfhood. There was little emphasis on individuality as modern cultures define it. The self was relational. One existed in relation to gods, ancestors, land, and future generations. The temple embodied this relational self physically. You were never the center. You were always part of something larger. This diminished the weight of personal failure. Mistakes were not identity defining. They were imbalances to be corrected. Ritual restored balance. Confession was less important than realignment. This approach softened shame and redirected attention toward repair rather than judgment. Silence inside the temple was not empty. It was expectant. Silence created space for subtle internal signals to emerge. Breathing became noticeable. Posture became noticeable. Small shifts in sensation gained importance. This awareness was not introspective in a modern psychological sense. It was embodied, quiet, and nonverbal. The temple did not ask, "How do you feel?" It asked, "Are you aligned?" This distinction mattered. Alignment could be adjusted without analysis. You moved, waited, repeated. Feeling followed action rather than leading it. Time spent inside the temple altered time perception. Without clocks, without urgency, without novelty, minutes lost sharp edges. This temporal softening allowed deeper states of attention to arise naturally. Modern terms might describe this as a mild trance. The Egyptians experienced it as proper presence. Children growing up around temples absorbed these states long before they could articulate them. They learned when to pause, when to watch, when to speak softly. These lessons were not taught explicitly. They were learned through exposure. The environment did the teaching. Even conflict resolution borrowed from temple logic. Disputes were framed in terms of balance rather than blame. The goal was restoration, not victory. This reduced escalation. When the aim is harmony, force becomes inefficient. The temple also acted as an emotional archive. Reliefs showed triumph, struggle, offering, gratitude, and devotion. These images provided emotional vocabulary without requiring personal disclosure. One could feel without speaking. As centuries passed and belief systems layered over one another, these emotional technologies remained embedded. Even when names of gods changed, the structure of experience endured. People continued to slow down, lower their voices, and feel watched by something larger than themselves. This persistence tells us something important. The temple worked because it aligned with fundamental properties of the human nervous system. It did not rely on persuasion. It relied on environment. And environments are powerful because they bypass argument. You may notice that imagining these temples does not excite the mind. It quiets it. Thoughts become fewer, longer, less insistent. This is not coincidence. You are mentally entering a space designed to do exactly that. And now, as our long, quiet journey through ancient Egyptian temples gently comes to rest, there is no lesson you need to remember and no conclusion you need to hold tightly. These temples were never meant to explain the world in words. They were meant to be experienced slowly, repeatedly, patiently, until understanding settled on its own. What they reveal across thousands of years is not only how the ancient Egyptians saw the universe, but how deeply they understood the human mind and body. They knew that attention follows space, that emotion follows rhythm. That meaning grows when life feels ordered, predictable, and connected to something larger than the self. They built environments that did not argue with the mind, but gently guided it, stone by stone, step by step, breath by breath. In these temples, belief was not demanded. It was cultivated. Calm was not forced. It emerged. Identity was not isolated. It was shared across time, land, ancestors, and generations yet unborn. Even silence had a role. Even waiting had meaning. And perhaps that is why, even now, long after the incense has faded and the chants have fallen quiet, these places still work. They still slow the body. They still soften the voice. They still invite reflection without instruction. They still remind us that not everything valuable needs to be loud, fast, or new. As you lie here, letting your breathing remain slow and steady, you might notice how little effort it takes to feel settled when there is nothing to solve, nothing to prove, nothing to rush toward. The ancient builders understood this state well. They designed for it. They trusted it. So allow the images of stone corridors, shadowed halls, and star-painted ceilings to drift gently through your mind without holding on to any single thought. Let them pass like echoes in a vast, quiet space. There is nowhere else you need to go tonight. If you are still awake, another gentle exploration may be waiting for you nearby. And if sleep is already pulling you under, you are free to follow it, knowing that the world has been held together before and will be held together again, quietly, patiently, just as it always has. Sleep well, and good night.